in this case, it was just a riotous environment. It resulted in a riot and some injuries to people. So it was prosecuted, and he could have settled it. I think that it was offered for him to settle this claim by doing a benefit concert, but he said no.
Life's Third Act is a podcast dedicated to helping you get the most out of your retirement. Sponsored by TuckerAllen. Here's attorney CPA Joe Cordell.
Welcome to another episode of Life's Third Act. This week we are going to talk about somebody that I know all of you will know, Jim Morrison. Now, those of you who are saying, Jim Morrison, who is that guy? I know one thing, you're under 40. You may be under 50 at least. But anyway, my daughter, I think, would be able to answer this, and she's 25. So anyway, Jim Morrison is a name that I'll assume we've all heard, and yet we often don't know as much about him other than the fact that he died in a tragic way. Many people know that he died young. Spoiler alert. Anybody doesn't know that. But he actually had a very interesting life, and from an estate planning standpoint, it's even more interesting in a way. So we talk about how things sometimes become complicated when you pass away and people are left here to figure stuff out, whatever that stuff is. Well, Jim Morrison is somebody who we think of as the ultimate carefree, sort of hippie type who you would think would not leave complicated financial matters in his wake. You would expect he wouldn't have financial matters much in his wake, especially since his career wasn't that long. You know, unlike many of the great success rockers, they had relatively long careers. So this one I think you'll find very interesting. I'm convinced that even if you know quite a bit about Jim Morrison, you might learn more from this. We don't purport to be authorities on really any of these people we talk about, but we do try to find interesting information. We make it our policy as we prepare for this show is to gather information from diverse sources and try to inject some interest in it to the extent I can, for example, solicit the opinion of lawyers who are involved in the cases directly. That's always very helpful. To the extent I can, I use second, even third tertiary sources. But yet I try to make sure that they're relatively accurate. If we get anything wrong, I'll say of this show as we do, as is always our position, please let us know. We like it when you comment. Even sometimes when you say things that we don't like to hear, we know we need to hear those things. So let us know how we can improve, and if there's anything that we say that you think could be corrected. So Jim Morrison is somebody, though, who he was important for music, of course, but he also introduced some items that we can talk about from which you'll learn, and that really is kind of I'm tempted to say the primary purpose of this show. We have two competing priorities. One is to entertain you, and the other is to inform and help you in a practical way. So to the extent that we accomplish both of those, then we know we're good. Anyway, Marlea, as always, is wonderful in terms of identifying these topics as well as doing research. And I'll ask her to lead us off. Let's introduce Jim Morrison and the Doors to those people under 40 who might not have heard of him or them.
Everything you build for you and your family deserves protecting. All of those important assets you have worked so hard to acquire and enjoy, you want to make sure they're handled with care. At TuckerAllen, our attorneys will customize an estate plan that will work for you and your family's goals and needs. TuckerAllen, estate planning, probate, and trust administration. Visit TuckerAllen.com.
The Doors were a band formed by Jim Morrison and Ray Manzarek. They were the lead singers, and they kind of had this unique sound and vision that they were looking for. And the band itself was completed by their drummer John Dinsmore and their guitarist Robbie Krieger. And they were together from 1967 to 1978. They were kind of a rock blues band. And actually, Justin and I were kind of laughing about this because, in their time, and as we'll go on to see, they were popular, but they weren't anywhere as near as popular as they are today. And we were kind of talking about how that's why I laughed when you say under 40, because I feel like it's still like a pivotal point in like your high school or college experience where you discover at least like one Doors song. You might not know like the band members or anything like that, but you're very familiar like with that Doors song. So they're kind of one of those bands that just have stayed around. They'll always, I feel like, be a band that's known. But yeah, they had, a couple of really good hits. They had 9 records. Their top hits were like Light My Fire, LA Woman, Life is Strange. And they were really just known for being super eccentric, kind of testing the waters in all types of areas of music, and really just, involved with their fans, sometimes not in the best way, but that's why people liked them, because they were a little bit out there for that time.
Yeah, it is interesting, the point you raised, that many people assume that Jim Morrison and the Doors were as popular during their lifetime, during Jim Morrison's lifetime, as thereafter. And it definitely is true that they're much bigger today than they were at the time. Although we should mention that they had, what did I read, like 6 top 10 hits, which is pretty good for a band that had released only, 9 studio albums at the time, up through 71. So, and they had a couple of live albums.
Yeah.
Now, there are a bunch of albums that have come since then, but again, this is after Jim's death. But there's no question that this band has lived on in terms of sales and the reputation, which means the value of the royalties. This is definitely a case where I don't think any of them could have foreseen that 50, 60 years down the road, they're going to still be generating lots of money through intellectual property, which we talk a lot about on this show. And even valuing the estate, which we'll come to later, but no one really knows. So when you see numbers stated, it's kind of funny, estimates of the value of these various many musicians who've died. We look at the numbers at the time of their death, and we see what the valuation was of the estate, and we shake our heads and think, whoa, that's way off.
Yep.
Because I think many people couldn't foresee. In some cases, like we talked about how Elvis, you can foresee that Elvis would have been big, but nobody could foresee how big. So in fairness, people would have said, oh yeah, Elvis is going to sell. He'll continue selling. The music will sell some. But no one foresaw how big. With the Doors, it's a little different because I don't think anybody really foresaw that the Doors were. I mean, I don't think people would have thought of them like they would, when John Lennon passed away or when Elvis passed away. So they were really a sleeping sort of treasure chest that wouldn't ultimately open until a few years after the death. And there's no question that Jim Morrison's extraordinary, controversial life and death contributed to the value of the band and the music.
Yeah.
And not being a musicologist or an expert on this topic, I do wonder to what extent his fame is more about him and his infamy than it is about the quality of the music. Now, I'm sure that there are some out there, those aficionados of Doors music, who will, I'm sure, argue passionately that no, it's nothing to do really with the fact that he was a strange person and died in a cataclysmic way. They would say, no, it's the music. It's the music. It's just that it wasn't discovered till he died. Yeah,
and I do wonder that too. And I honestly wonder if it was just, the time that they were popular, because the kind of music that they were doing wasn't everybody's taste. But like nowadays, everybody has music interest all over because we have music right in the palm of our hands now. So you can have music tastes that are all like completely different and completely separate from each other. And I think that, like, not just Jim Morrison, but I think that lends itself to why they became so popular, was just kind of the time frame and then it growing from there. And I feel like everybody has that moment of rediscovery for them, and they're like, wait, like, they're really good. I wanna listen to more of them. Kind of the same with Elvis. I mean, Elvis was very popular, but like you said, he went on to become even more popular, and like women loved him, and just all of those bands that we kind of see that didn't have the best go at it in their very first round, and then something tragic happens, of course, that lends itself to their infamy. But I think their music as well is just something that they were kind of different during the time frames that they were in, and that's why they're so popular today.
Yeah, and we're it's good for people to keep in mind that we're talking about a period that went from, when were they formed? Was it in 65?
Yes, 65. Their first album was released in 67.
Okay, so they were formed, and they dispersed, at least when Jim Morrison went away. The band went on to some sort of, but not with any noticeable success. So it goes up until Morrison's death in 71. So this is, unlike the Beatles, which the Beatles started in 62, I think. Maybe even 61.
Yeah, I think it was,
Paul and John and George had been together since the late 50s. So at least John and Paul. So in this case, this is a relatively short window of time, and they achieved lots of success in a sort of chaotic set of circumstances. Yes. And this is a good springboard to let's introduce who Jim Morrison was, a little bit about his background.
Yeah, so he was born December 8th in Florida, and his mom was Clara, Virginia, and then his dad was George Morrison, and his dad was actually a rear admiral of the U.S. Navy. So, wow. Yeah, so you think of this kid who, kind of went on to be this great rock singer, and he's very, very out there, having a dad that, is in the military, and he grew up an Army brat. He kind of went all over the United States. He lived definitely in Florida, a lot in California, spent a lot of time there.
Virginia.
Yeah, Virginia. Yep. But I just think it's kind of interesting that was his family dynamic, and then he was, came out of that.
And he also had this is not one of those rock stars that had a troubled family life. I mean, he had by all accounts, this very healthy, intact family. He had 2 siblings. Was it 2 sisters?
Yes, 2 sisters.
Okay. And so he had just this, this very wholesome family life. And you can imagine his dad, this officer in the military, who incidentally was apparently quite a pilot. He was an aviator who had achieved recognition during the 50s, I guess. I don't know if it was the Korean War, but he was quite a pilot, and of course working up to rear admiral. That's near the very top of the ladder in that field or in the Navy. So anyway, how did he get along with his parents, given his personality?
Yeah, so, I think they really adored him as a child. They knew he was kind of out there. In school and elementary, he loved reading. His teachers remember him because, he loved reading. He was one of their top readers in the class. But his teachers would ask him, hey, what are you reading? And he would tell them, just these really out there books. And his teacher was
he's a fan of Nietzsche, right?
Yeah, and his teachers were like, what is this? And so they would go and look it up, and it would be publishings from the 1500s, 1600s of demonic practices and all kinds of just very strange things. But nobody really tried to tamper that in him. I don't think his parents were necessarily fond of it, but they were probably like, oh, this is just, a phase. Later on, we'll kind of see that his dad didn't really support his music. His mom did, but I don't think that it ever got to the point of them being like, no, we want nothing to do with you because of, who you are and your music. As we'll kind of go on to see in his adult life, he struggled a lot with addiction, and I think they were definitely there to try to help him in whatever way he allowed them to, which I don't think was a lot, but
yeah,
I don't think he necessarily had a strained relationship with his parents. I just thought I think they thought he was just a very odd kid.
Yeah, and that's similar to the take that I was getting from a couple of sources. It was, they were estranged in a sense of the word, meaning that his dad had a very strong sense of right and wrong, and he saw his son, sort of going down these paths of rebellion, And it just violated everything that his dad understood as being what's right and best for his son, because his dad had succeeded because he wasn't rebellious. And he knew that in his mind, following the rules was very important. He was from a generation that believed that. And so I think that he and his dad argued a lot. His mother, I'm sure, was more of the peacemaker, but yeah, you're right. Both parents loved him and both were there for him, though he wasn't communicating with them much at the very end.
Yeah, and there was this point in his life too, and his parents. This is what kind of like you'll just see like the difference between like him and his parents. But it was in like 1947, I believe. It was when he was younger. They were traveling somewhere, and they passed by an accident. And as Jim recalls it, and he's spoken about it a lot, it was like an overturned truck that he saw, and then he saw a bunch of Native Americans lying next to it injured. And for some reason, this has like stuck with him throughout a long, long period of time. And he wrote a lot of music about this. He based a lot of songs on it. And he was like, I guess, just very traumatized by it. And when his family was asked, like, you know, what actually happened in that crash, they're like, yeah, we drove by a crash, but it wasn't anything like he describes. So I think that's just like the differences of like how his brain works versus how their brain works. And they recall like him being upset by it, but they were like, you know, it wasn't anything big. And so I think that was just kind of defines the differences between all of them.
It seems almost a bit like a movie trope, you know, where you've got the very strict military dad and the musician kid and how they butt heads. You know, we've seen this story so many times.
Yes.
Yeah, we have. And I can see where this is probably his first exposure to violence and you know, and blood of some sort. And his dad, of course, had seen that probably throughout his career to some extent. So I think the parents were unmoved by it, but you never know what's going to make a enduring impression on your child's brain when they're real young. And he was, I mean, we can't forget, whatever we say, whether you like him or don't like him, you know, I think everyone will agree that he had this very, very sensitive, artistic personality, and I think that things like that would strike him in a different way from maybe what it would an average kid.
Yeah.
But I saw too where what you were describing, he was a big reader. He read everything. His vocabulary, people would talk about the fact that he had this huge vocabulary, which was a result of his reading so many different genres of books. But he read fiction and nonfiction, read philosophy and Oriental philosophy, and he was somebody who was very curious. He probably was, in a sense of the word, an intellectual.
Yes.
So he ended up going to college. Why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, so he actually, after he graduated high school, he went to live with his grandparents in Florida, back in Florida. He went to St. Petersburg Junior College, and then he transferred to FSU. But while he was at FSU, he actually got arrested for disturbing the peace at a football game. And so I didn't really read this anywhere, but I'm assuming that they kicked him out. And then he went on to go back to California, and he went to UCLA, and he graduated from their theater school. And
film school, wasn't it?
Yes, sorry, film school. And he does have an undergraduate degree. He did dabble in like a couple of short films in the beginning of his life, but he also met Ray there, so that's kind of how he got started he got started in forming the band, and kind of just adds to his experience. I think he was very theatrical, and I think, like you said, he was very artistic. He really liked that poetry, and that really fed into who the Doors became.
Yeah, and it's important for people to note that this coming together between him and Manzarek, who really was the second most prominent member of the band, and quite frankly, after Morrison's death, is the person that the face of the band. Even when it quit being a band, he was the face that would talk about it.
Yep. Yeah.
And he was very. Those of you who've heard him during interviews, he's very articulate. Manzarek. There's more of this, so I've heard a lot more of him than I have Jim Morrison, who wasn't interviewed in those. those sort of settings so often. But I'm struck by how articulate Manzarek is and how he's a very bright guy. So you can imagine these two very talented, very smart people coming together at UCLA Film School in the early 60s or mid-60s. And I can see how, had these two not met each other, their lives would, we may not have never heard, we likely would never have heard of either of them. That's my theory.
Yeah.
I just think that you put these two together, and I think he brought something that, despite Jim Morrison's talent, I'm not sure that it would have happened for him, because we could imagine, as we talk a little bit more about Jim Morrison, how things could easily have gone bad for him the way his dad had imagined. His dad wasn't exercising great leaps in imagination to conclude that his son was going to end up in prison. It was a likely path.
Yes.
That was the path that he was seeing coming, or if not in prison, broke. And for that statement to make sense, let's talk on a little bit about his life after the two came together in the band.
Yeah, definitely. And just to add to that prior point, he lived just like a very nomadic lifestyle before the band. He actually lived on top of a rooftop after he graduated. So I think like it definitely, they were leading up to obviously like, the 70s, the hippie movement, so on and so forth. But they were just like very spiritual people. And had they not met each other, I definitely don't think that they would have, become anything, which sounds really mean, but I mean, it was just these two people that came together and they were like, oh, you're supposed to be together doing this thing. But
yeah, and I think that's a point worth making about these musicians that we often talk about generally is we can think of lots of examples where we would say, no, that's not true of groups. Like I would argue that John Lennon and Paul McCartney, that they would individually, they're both ambitious, Paul especially, and they were both talented and talented in a broad sense. And they could sing, they could play, they could write music. Keith Richards and Mick Jagger, to use those examples we used a few minutes ago, I think that's a case where if they had met each other, I think they still would have been successful. They were both very talented, and they were both very ambitious, despite Keith Richards makes a point to try to appear like he's not, but they both are very, very disciplined and ambitious despite their lifestyles. And I think that's true of a lot of people that come together as a band, but as you and I were just saying, I think Jim Morrison, I'm not sure. He was such a mess, and we'll talk about that here. But Manzarek came into his life, and Manzarek needed him. So I think that they were pillars of that band.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit more about Jim Morrison's life after this.
Yeah, so they formed the Doors, and then in January of 1967, they released their debut album just called The Doors. And that is where Light My Fire came from. That was their first hit single, and it just kind of blew up from there. Like I said, it will make them sound like they were a lot bigger than they were, just because they did have tours. They did, travel the world to have their tours and so on and so forth. But their concerts weren't, like 100,000 plus people or what have you. They had a very like niche set of fans, and they did well for what they did during their time. But their popularity was still kind of small. And so they started off kind of in that rock era and singing rock songs. And then they moved on and they dabbled a bit in the blues in the Morrison Hotel album that they released in, I believe, 1970. And then they went on to release LA Woman, which was the last one with Jim Morrison. And they still had like a touch of blues in there. But they did.
That was probably Was that the sixth album?
Yes, that was the sixth album.
Yeah. Okay.
But, they did very well. And something that we were talking about, too, that we were curious about is Jim Morrison actually wrote most of the songs leading up to their fourth album, The Soft Parade, but he didn't get credited for them. They credit it as just the Doors writing the songs. And then
that means all four members at that time would legally own the royalty rights.
Yeah, and then it wasn't until The Soft Parade, and in The Soft Parade they started kind of dabbling in that brass music as well. But it wasn't until then that they actually started giving credit to who wrote the songs. And each individual band member actually had their own song in The Soft Parade. So we just kind of, like we were saying off camera, we found that interesting that we don't know if they necessarily recognized that they were supposed to fight for their song rights or if they just didn't really care. But we found that kind of funny.
That is interesting to me. And I read about musicians of the era and how they realized, many of them, despite they are part of this hippie, non-materialistic generation, so to speak, those were the consumers of their music. But these musicians notoriously were very conscious of the fact that the way that you made millions for life is that you get your name as the writer, the composer of the music or the whatever artistic piece it is. And they all, guarded that, like Lennon, McCartney, they were very fastidious about assuring their names appeared. And even though each of them would write some of the songs individually, in effect, they agreed early on, and it made sense. It was in their mutual interest that there are songs that bear both their names that they didn't really both write together so much, but it didn't matter. It was a fair deal. They were both involved. They were both writing hits. And, of course, we can think of Bob Dylan and so many others who had many, many hits, and their wealth is attributable entirely to that. So I do think this wasn't something that most of these musicians came across for the first time, in their later adulthood. Yeah. I think they knew in the 60s. I think the record company managers and the producers were telling them. I think they were all, informed. I think that what makes this different is that we have somebody who really was kind of indifferent about such things. I don't think that Jim Morrison lacked knowledge because there had to be people around him who told him. But maybe that's the reason they started breaking it out separately.
Yeah.
But early on, just so people are clear, that does mean that the royalties coming in would essentially be divided with 25% of those royalties going to each of the four members up through those albums. And then thereafter, that would be based on whatever name they chose to put on the song. And Jim Morrison continued to write hits after that, though he slowed down by the time he got into 1971. He wasn't as productive as he had been.
Yeah, and their record company was Elektra Records, which was, it's a bigger company. So, they had somebody telling them, like, hey, you might want to put your name on this. But like we were talking about before, they weren't, I don't think in the very beginning they were really in it for the money because they just lived those nomadic lifestyles. They didn't really care. They're just kind of like, oh, let's form a band. Like, this might go somewhere. Yeah. This might be fun. But kind of moving on from there, Jim really started to get into, the drugs and alcohol during this time frame. He did also have a longtime girlfriend, Pamela Corison, and they started dating in 1965, all the way up until his death. So we don't know how big of a factor she was in introducing him to all of that. I think a lot of it was just, the fame got a hold of him. He kind of had some problems in college with it already, but he had a lot of arrests also, not just the one at Florida State, but he had them, here I have a list right in front of me. So 1963, he had 6, I believe, 1966, 1967, 1968, 1969, and then 1970 was the biggest arrest where they were performing at a concert and he started yelling kind of obscene things to the crowds, and then he got arrested for public indecency and public drunkenness. And so that's kind of where you start to see everything fall apart for the Doors. They actually split up for a little while, and then they did kind of reconcile, and they came back together, and they released LA Woman, but it kind of just all fell apart from there. He just couldn't stop getting in trouble. A lot of the other band members were just really tired of it. He wasn't really growing up, even though he was, 25, 26, 27, and had this big name for himself. And I think they just kind of got tired.
Yeah, it was kind of sad to read about this spiraling downward that you see with alcoholics and people who have chemical dependencies of all sorts. Is ultimately it grows worse. And you don't plateau and stay there very long. And in cases where some people have fame and money and power, then they just spiral all the more spectacularly.
Yes.
And in his case, he was on this path where he had all these arrests. I mean, since he was, as you said, in college, he was somebody who just resisted authority. He was unwilling to comply with rules. Alcohol made it worse. Additional drugs made it even worse. Many of those arrests were things relating to public drunkenness and disorderly conduct. That was most of the arrests.
Yes.
The one that resulted in a felony conviction in the state of Florida, I think, was where he was accused of exposing himself to the crowd and this defiance to police, where there had already been problems. The crowd was unhappy with his performance, and we can't ignore that. A lot of this deterioration was manifest in inferior concerts and dissatisfaction in the audience. So we do know that audiences are awful forgiving to musicians that have drinking and drug problems. We see that, Hank Williams on down, where the audience tend to be very forgiving, but still, they're not happy at the time. And in this case, it was just a riotous environment. It resulted in a riot and some injuries to people. So it was prosecuted, and he could have settled it. And this is an example of his indifference to consequences. Was, I think that it was offered for him to settle this claim by doing a benefit concert in Miami or wherever it was. I think it was Miami.
Yeah.
But he said no, just because he felt he was not going to cooperate with the pigs, quote unquote. And so he ends up getting this conviction, which oddly enough, I think in 2010, sometime in the 21st century, it's been lifted.
It was the anniversary. It was his birthday. It was like the 67th anniversary. His 67th birthday, not the anniversary of anything, but they did lift it.
A pardon.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a pardon by the governor, I think. Anyway, so this had a huge impact on the band. So the band is putting up with a lot of this, where he's probably largely the reason anybody shows up to begin with, but the downside is he's the reason that they don't show up, and the reason that they are now forbidden to have concerts in a variety of venues. They had a tour coming up, and they were canceled because these cities knew and these venues knew there was going to be liability, there was going to be protests, that this was at a time when America wasn't liberal like it is today. And so the venues were saying, look, these people are the Doors are too much trouble.
Yeah.
Really, Jim Morrison is too much trouble. So here they are when they need this tour to promote their album, and they're being canceled because of his conduct. And so it's understandable that the band was unhappy with him. And as you said, there was this estrangement and then reconciliation of sorts. And take us from there. So I hope that you've enjoyed today's show as we talked about Jim Morrison. Fascinating guy, lots of interesting things, both about his life and thereafter. So much so that we've decided to break it into 2 parts. So we'll complete part 1 today, and then next week we'll pick up with part 2. So I hope that you join us for part 2 then. Take care.
You've been listening to Life's Third Act, a podcast for thriving in retirement, Sponsored by TuckerAllen, your estate and elder law advisors. Each week, we discuss topics and answer questions to help you better plan for your future. For more information, visit TuckerAllen.com. Subscribe and listen again next week for another edition of Life's Third Act. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.